Well, hey, everybody, welcome back to the Katie Phang News Channel. I got a familiar face, not really sitting next to me, although it would have been a privilege to have him sitting next to me. I got my good friend over here, David Jolly. You may recognize him from places like MSNBC. And frankly, maybe you recognize him for when he did a stint in Congress on behalf of the state of Florida. But David's making waves these days and hitting the media because he's announced to run for governor of the state of Florida. As we talk about often here at the Katie Phang News Channel, running for office on a local, state, municipal level, I'm telling all of you guys to get in there, do it, because most of your politics, if not all of your politics, is going to be local. And we've seen a shift towards an emphasis towards state politics these days. And so, David Jolly, welcome to the Katie Phang News Channel.
Hey, great to be with you. Thank you, Katie.
David, let's talk about a little bit of an elephant in the room, because you know me, I'm going to be a little hard-hitting about some stuff. And you know, it's funny because I've had the same evolution as you, although our timing was just a little bit off, but you've gone from Republican to being an independent to being a Democrat. And in a day and age when party politics is particularly polarized and partisan, that's a lot of P's. Why now, David? If somebody were to say to you that you're just trying to capitalize perhaps on a vacuum for representation of the Democratic Party in Florida for running for the governor, what would you say to that criticism?
Look, I'm not sure anybody in their right mind would get in a race for governor. It's not as though it's an easy task to jump in. But look, here's what I would tell you about my journey over the last 10 years. You're right. I was a Republican in Congress. I was then an independent for about 6 years. And today I'm a Florida Democrat. And part of my story of change is actually the strength of this candidacy. I think a lot of people have changed. Most voters have changed. If you think about your personal politics in the last 10 years, some have hardened their positions. Few have hardened their positions. But the last 10 years has forced a lot of us to think through where are our personal politics. And so change is part of our story. I don't think the problem today is politicians who change. I think it's politicians who won't change when presented with new framing and new information and a new set of challenges. But this is very important because I think there's a difference when we think about this between values and policy positions. And I really mean this after some self-reflection. I would suggest to you that my values haven't changed from, frankly, when I was a preacher's kid in South Florida in Miami to when I entered politics as a Republican to being an independent or a Democrat. When it comes to the role of government, what are the values that I think we see and what do I see in today's Democratic Party? I think the economy should work for everybody, not just the rich and the reckless. The economy should lift everyone up. I think the government should actually serve the people that it represents, right? It's seniors, it's veterans, it's storm victims, families in need of excellence in public education. So the economy should work, the government should serve its people. And finally, we need to be a state and a country. We need to be communities where everyone is welcome, regardless of where you were born, the color of your skin, who you love or who you worship. Those are values. And I would suggest when I was a Republican in Congress, those were my values. When I was fighting for marriage equality and climate science and gun control and campaign finance reform, when I was an independent trying to empower the democracy reform movement through open primaries, gerrymandering reform, ranked choice voting, I was trying to increase participation in our democracy. And today as a Florida Democrat, I have those same values. So the values have remained the same, but I have changed positions on hard questions like reproductive freedom, guns, other issues. That is part of my story. That is part of my journey, and it's not one I shy away from.
So, David, what is the evolution of your positions on something like reproductive freedom?
Yeah, so when I entered politics, I'm the son of a minister, as I mentioned, and what I eventually discovered is I was wrongly applying my personal faith teachings to constitutional questions, and so I went into Congress opposed to the Roe framework, opposed to Roe v. Wade. Now, you could immediately see me wrestling with that for anyone who actually cared to follow my journey back then, as I became the only Republican in the House to vote against the Planned Parenthood investigation. When Republicans moved to rescind funding from Planned Parenthood, I offered a compromise to move that money to community health centers. Still not good enough, as I eventually learned. But then I also got to the harder questions wrestling with the Roe-Casey framework, Roe v. Wade and Casey v. Planned Parenthood. And as an attorney, really arrived at the place where I understood that's the proper framework to ensure reproductive freedom, to keep healthcare decisions between a patient and their doctor, but also, Katie, to allow people of faith and others with convictions around the issue to celebrate their teachings of faith and to evangelize and win hearts and minds. The balancing test between reproductive freedom and the state's interest in viability I saw as being the right framework in Roe and Casey. And then that was prior to Dobbs, but certainly you move past Dobbs into the real darker themes of some of the restrictive laws now. And I am for the full codification of the Roe Casey framework at the state and federal level. That's not where I was 12 years ago. It is where I am now. And that journey is part of the strength of our campaign. To be honest, I really mean that. I'm glad I've made that journey, right? I would hate to be stuck where I was 12 years ago, or at least denying what I thought should be the answer just for political purposes.
Do you think it's a fair comparison when people compare you to Charlie Crist? For those of you that are tuning in and that are watching this, Charlie Crist also had his own evolution from a party change, was our governor in Florida, ran again. And, his evolution also went from Republican to Democrat. You think it's a fair comparison, David, for people to say that this is just another Charlie Crist 2.0?
Yeah, I don't. And I say this respectfully about Charlie, but, I'm not sure anyone ever believed Charlie's journey. Charlie changed parties about 3 times in 10 or 12 months, and it was always about running for office. He lost to Rubio as a Republican, so he became an independent, lost that race, so he ran as a Democrat to run again. But more importantly, Charlie would always say, I didn't leave the party left me. David Jolly left the party, right? That is my story. I left the party, and I'm proud of having left the party. And I would also point out it was never about running for office, right? I mean, I challenged my own party. I was the only Republican to call on Donald Trump to drop out of the presidential race in the 16 cycle as I was a sitting Republican member of Congress, the only one not to support him. I did that as a Republican despite how it would hurt me politically. I then spent time as an independent, thoroughly enjoying it, but with no purpose, no electoral purpose behind that. And together with my wife, we make independent political decisions, but we started allying with the Democratic community in the Trump years. I think a lot of the independent space found themselves to be part of what I call the Democratic coalition. So ultimately entering this race for governor as a Democrat was not really a pivot. It was just the natural place for me to be.
David, how do you tackle, though, the reality which I discuss all of the time, either, here on YouTube or on other places, the fundamental reality that I don't think it's a fair assessment to say that Florida is a purple state. I think Florida, in large part, is a decidedly red state. And you have somebody like Congressman Byron Donalds, who's had the endorsement of Donald Trump right now, MAGA Byron. And despite Ron DeSantis, who's term limited and he's getting booted in 2026, and some discussion that maybe Ron DeSantis wants to see his wife, Casey, take over that gubernatorial kind of position. Your thoughts about how you tackle somebody like Byron Donalds, who is, again, has got the stamp of approval from Donald Trump in a very red Florida?
Sure, Katie, every cycle and every race is different. This is an election cycle where we are in the midst of a national change environment. We saw it in the New York City mayor's race. We've seen it in our congressional special elections in Florida, where Democrats outperformed by 15 or 16. We saw it in the Wisconsin Supreme Court race and the Omaha mayor's race. This is a change election environment going into what essentially is the 6th year of a Donald Trump presidency. And we are in the midst of an affordability crisis nationally, but certainly in the state of Florida. And so with an affordability crisis that is making housing out of reach for many Floridians, half of the state is now what they term as ALICE, asset limited, income constrained, but employed, meaning you're employed, but you're living paycheck to paycheck. That's half the state. And so we are in a crisis cycle, in a change cycle. And very importantly, in terms of voter registration, sure, Republicans have more registrations than Democrats, but we're also ignoring about a third of the state who are independents. And so the way I look at the Florida numbers, Katie, are about 39% of the state are registered as Republicans. I believe we will get 15% of those who are registered Republicans. That brings the loyal Republican vote down to about 33%. Give us 67% in the midst of a change environment to try to get 51%. And when the question ultimately next November, whether it is Byron Donalds or Casey DeSantis as the Republican nominee, David Jolly is the Democratic nominee, the question is, in the midst of the generational affordability crisis in Florida, do you want change or do you want more of the same? Because more of the same is what has given us the affordability crisis. Republicans have been in charge for 25 years. If you're going to give them another 4 years, we're going to have more of the same. If we have an opportunity as Florida voters to elect a Democratic governor, we get change.
But David, how do you peel off 15% of Republicans in a state like Florida?
Yeah, so listen, you actually start with 8 or 9%. That's true. Sometimes going both ways, not so much in a Trump environment. But we will already start with about, let's call it 8%. But it's also because I spent so much time as a independent. I also have strong Republican relationships. And here's the most important thing, because I'm focusing on what Republicans won't focus on, Republican leaders, the affordability crisis. This race, the governorship of Florida, is not about Donald Trump. Byron Donalds wants it to be about Donald Trump. This is about generational property insurance relief, generational property tax reform. This is about generational investments in public education instead of teachers being paid dead last in the nation, which is a moral wrong, trying to get Florida to the top half of the nation. This is about, when it comes to crime, we're going to fight crime, but not communities. We're going to embrace our immigrant community, and we're going to stop culture wars, put an end to culture wars, and let everybody be welcome and respected and return dignity to all Floridians. Nothing about that is about Donald Trump. And so I would agree with you if you're a deep red, loyal Republican voter, and the question seems to be framed as a question around Donald Trump, you probably aren't willing to pull the lever for a Democrat. But if you hear a Democrat saying, look, I'm just trying to make sure your kids can get a good education. I'm trying to cut your property insurance by half. I'm trying to give property tax relief to first-time home buyers. I'm trying to keep our community safe and make sure your kids feel welcome to grow up in the state of Florida and be who they want to be. Listen, we're already at 15%. The reason the polls have closed by 10 points in 3 weeks is because Republicans want to hear that message, but Republican politicians won't deliver it to them.
So then, David, why not stay as an independent? Why become a registered Democrat? Sure. Why not lean into your Republican upbringing and your Republican experience, your familiarity with Democrat circles, but stay squarely down the center as an independent, especially if there's such a large percentage of independents in the state of Florida?
Yeah, so several reasons. One, as I mentioned, I think the Democratic values are perfectly aligned with where my politics are. The economy should work for everyone. The government should work. Everyone should be welcome. Secondly, nationally and in the state of Florida, we have rigged our politics against minor parties in the independent space. We simply have. We've made it incredibly difficult, particularly by using the campaign finance system, for an independent candidacy to be viable unless you're sitting on $100 million you want to spend yourself. And even then it gets exceedingly hard because voter behavior has not yet come around to a multi-party democracy. Look, I do think, Katie, if you follow the data, let's make this a national, international question. Multi-party democracies have greater voter participation, greater voter turnout, greater voter satisfaction, more consensus in policymaking. All that is true. But the major parties across the country and in the state of Florida have ensured that minor parties in the independent space have enormous challenges to get to a point of viability. So I don't shy away from the Democratic values. I'm a proud Florida Democrat, but we have to be a party that amplifies our values and builds a coalition that is bigger than simply registered Democratic voters. What I like about being a Democrat is you get to accept math, Katie. There are not enough Democratic voters in the state of Florida to elect a Democrat by themselves. This has to be a coalition that rests on Democratic values, but ultimately is bigger than the party and reaches independents and Republicans. That change only happens, a win next November only happens through a Democratic nominee for governor, not an independent.
David, do you think that you could successfully, because I hear very clearly, and as somebody, by the way, who's a Florida resident, who pays taxes, who has homeowners insurance, and is stressed about all of that, I hear your affordability campaign, I hear your affordability argument, and I would concur that a dollar is a dollar. It doesn't have a D or an R or an I in front of it, right? A dollar is a dollar with no party affiliation. But how do you successfully frame it, David, where some of the stronger, thicker-headed Republicans in certain portions of Florida don't want to abandon the kind of culture wars aspect of what's going on in the battle, and that they are so quick to, for example, I mean, you brought up the New York City mayoral primary and the result that we saw, which was encouraging, and yet I feel like is kind of specific to the New York ecosystem. So I don't know if it's necessarily fair, David, to make an apples to apples comparison of what happened in New York to Florida. So how do you convince a Republican voter that you're not going to do something, and I'll bring up what's always been kind of the boogeyman lately, like trans issues. Like you're not going to, do something for a Republican who wants to
Sure.
prioritize a trans issue over maybe their homeowner's insurance premium.
Sure, sure. And look, I would say the thread between New York, Omaha, congressional specials, Wisconsin, Florida, people want change. But change in different states looks different, right? In Florida, we reject socialism. We won't elect a socialist Democrat in the state of Florida. In fact, I'm the first Democrat in a very long time, Katie, you know this, willing to go into Miami and say socialism is wrong, communism is wrong, capitalism lifts everybody up. But we're the party that's going to fight for fair capitalism. And where your personal economy gets disrupted, we're the party that's going to make sure you have access to safe housing and to health care and to transportation. And instead of falling and hitting pavement, you're going to fall and be caught by a safety net. We believe in fair capitalism that lifts everybody up. Maybe that's not the message in Manhattan, but that's for Manhattan voters to decide. What I would say to, the hard right voters, first and foremost, the MAGA voters, do you want to cut your property insurance in half in the state of Florida? Because it's going to take a state catastrophic fund that recognizes the private property market has failed. The insurance market has failed in Florida. We cannot cover hurricanes in the private market any longer. We need a state cat fund. Florida Republicans won't do that, but I will. So if you're a MAGA voter in Florida, do you want to cut your insurance in half? If you're a first-time home buyer, do you want us to actually provide a 4 or 5 year stepped-up basis to your taxes as you buy some property from someone who's owned it for 20 years under Save Our Homes, and now you have to absorb the escalation in taxes? That's our plan. That's not the Republican plan. And here's what I would say on putting an end to culture wars. And this is important because you're right. Some people want to see the culture wars continue. And even on the far left, when I say put an end, some people say, well, what do you mean? Do you mean resign, declare a loss? Look, we're going to be a state where we're working in good faith towards equity for everybody. And I will defend every community across the state of Florida because it is a moral right, but also a constitutional right. But I would also say to my friends on the right, when it comes to putting an end to culture wars, that does mean that everybody is protected. That means the faith community is protected. That means that the faith community is lifted up. Their rights to evangelize are lifted up, but also are the individual rights of people who reject the teachings of faith and reject the culture wars that Republicans have promised. I don't think that providing constitutional protections and equity for everybody across the state of Florida furthers culture wars. I think it ends it. But it is not to declare a win or a loss for any specific community, including my Republican friends in the faith community.
If you're going to be giving the Republicans a run for their money, David, then why not go back to D.C.? Go back to D.C. as a Democrat. Why are you focusing on something like a statewide run?
Because how you open this, the greatest opportunity to effectuate change, I believe, is at the governor's level. And it is not in the U.S. Senate. It is not in the legislature, not in the Congress. There is a collective inefficiency. Or there's an inefficiency of collective decision making in the legislature. I experienced that. That is not the place for me. We have young children. I'm not going to do the commute either. But I would say for Democrats nationally, coming off of the loss, the presidential loss, as the party regains its footing, I think state governorship races are a great place to demonstrate democratic values, big ideas to big problems, and demonstrate change. So in Florida, in Michigan, in Texas, in California, I think we have an opportunity to really meet voters where they are at. In Florida, it's an affordability crisis. Maybe it's different in Michigan, but in Florida, it's the affordability crisis.
David, how do you navigate something like winning the gubernatorial race, being a Democratic governor, but still having a very, very large Republican showing in your Senate, in your House, like in Tallahassee? There is a certain very strong, right now Republicans control the Senate and the House right now in Tallahassee. How do you navigate that when you talk about an inefficiency quotient or an inefficiency component that frustrates you? How would you navigate something like that?
Yeah, before we made the final decision to get in, my wife and I wrestled with two questions. One, can we win? I know we can win. For the first time in 30 years, I believe there's an opportunity to win. Secondly, if you win, can you be effective as a Democratic governor, right? Here's two things that answer that question very loudly, yes. The first is, and I lament we're at a place in Florida history where I have to say this, but if I have the opportunity to be elected governor, one of the first things I get to do is review and replace and fire most of Ron DeSantis's appointees to the state university system, to the water district boards, to the public service commission. It is a national story how he has put ideologues, unqualified, inexperienced ideologues in places of important leadership in institutions. So whether it's academia, whether it's ensuring we have clean water and clean air and actually bringing back people who believe in climate science, whether it's bringing in clean and renewable energies to how we regulate our utilities and actually drive down costs for consumers, but also ensure proper stewardship. A governor gets to fire a lot of people and replace them. And I say that with lament because I hate we are in an era now of such a reactionary space, but Ron DeSantis has really crippled our institutions with ideologues. So that's the first place you get to be effective. But the second, to your point, so look, I think we need a state catastrophic fund. That is a landmark generational move for the state economy. Just stick with that for a moment and talk about public education. I think we need to give teachers a 30% pay raise. I think we need to greatly constrict our school choice program, not kill it, but we need to ensure that the same rules apply to private schools that apply to public schools, the way they provide education to our kids. And so those are big ideas, right? Here's what I would suggest about Republicans having to cooperate a little bit. If Florida voters elect a Democratic governor, not if David Jolly wins, this is really important. If in 2026, Florida voters bring generational change, right? An earthquake election to the state of Florida and elect a Democrat in a deep red state, the home of MAGA, Donald Trump's home. If Florida voters demand that level of change, then the issue isn't so much between Governor Jolly and Republicans in the legislature. It's between Republicans in the legislature and their voters, because they have to play defense now. They have to explain why they're against cutting your property insurance in half, against paying teachers more, against greater investments in public education. That's a hard spot for Republicans to be at. Does that get us everything that we're running on? Maybe not, but does it get us a pretty good ways down the road? I bet it does. I bet we could take the state hurricane fund and fund it over 3 years to actually build up something that starts to look like a CAT fund. I bet we could get teachers a 20% pay raise, maybe 25% pay raise over 3 or 4 years. I do think there's a lot we could do.
I also think we could probably start, David, with that $450 million that Ron DeSantis wants to use for the alligator Alcatraz.
That's right.
That is just mind-blowing to me and inhumane and horrible. David Jolly, I'm going to be watching this race very carefully. And not just because I'm a Floridian and not because you and I are friends and not because I'm a Democrat. I think you could tell from the questions that I posed to you. I have, some legitimate interest in getting the answers to what I think are some pretty tough questions that I posed to you, because it's not an easy lift, I think, for a Democrat in a state like Florida. But I would agree with you that, it's time for a change. Change is a necessary thing. And I think that's, the promise that your campaign brings. So thank you. Thank you for taking the time to join me here at the Katie Phang News Channel. I'm looking forward to, like I said, watching this race and seeing what develops and what comes next.
Thank you, Katie. I know we can win. The moment is meeting us halfway. Our job is to put in the work and meet the moment halfway as well.
Well, thank you, David Jolly. It's good to see you.
Thank you.
Katie Phang here. The truth matters now more than ever. So hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a thing. Thanks for watching.